Westminster, and we established a Scottish Parliament and a Scottish government, and we undermined the system of democracy that we've had for centuries, 300 years. And the United Kingdom managed to avoid the disaster that would have befallen it had Scotland voted to break away last autumn. But look what's happened now. The Scottish National Party has almost 100% of the seats allocated to Scotland in the Westminster Parliament because of the peculiarities of the British voting system. The Scottish National Party is in the driving seat of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. They're going after us. They want a second referendum at some point in the future. And the United Kingdom, to all intents and purposes, is disunited. And I never ever thought that I would buy a British magazine, now brought prospectively, which is referred to the British question. We've all heard about the Cyprus question, the Palestine question, the Kashmir question. Now we have the British question. And this is because the United Kingdom, back in 1998, chose to appease Scottish nationalists, surrender power from the centralised institutions of Westminster, and embark upon a constitutional experiment which has now returned to haunt the very advocates of devolution. So the United Kingdom is just about surviving, but we don't know for how much longer. And some people are saying Mr. Cameron may be the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in its present format. I hope not, and I may play my part, small though it be, to try to hold the United Kingdom together and to try to put this island together as well. So let me now turn to Cyprus. And remember, Cyprus and the UK share a similarity in that they are both islands. Great Britain rather is an island, Cyprus is an island. What's going on in Nicosia? Well, there was a joint statement, so-called, issued in February of last year, 11th of February of 2014, by Dr. Eroglu and Mr. Anastasiadis, in which, that's Mr. Akinci, the successor, of course, to Mr. Dr. Eroglu. The objective is that to reach a settlement as soon as possible and to hold separate, simultaneous referenda thereafter. Note the word separate, because bicommunalism is predicated on separation, the separation of people, the carving up of the population into two parts. And the word separate appears in the joint statement. The settlement will be based, it says, on a bicommunal, bizonal federation with political equality as set out in the relevant Security Council resolutions and the high-level agreements, which used to be called guidelines, but have been rechristened agreements. The United Cyprus, it goes on, as a member of the UN and of the European Union, shall have a single legal personality and a single sovereignty, which is defined as the sovereignty which is enjoyed by all member states of the United Nations under the UN Charter, and which emanate equally from Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. As I will explain in a moment or two, this is the doctrine of separate but equal, which was branded as unconstitutional in the United States in the field of education as long ago as 1954. This doctrine, separate but equal, was the doctrine that was the basis of apartheid in South Africa. And it's the basis of the joint statement, and it's the basis of bicommunalism. As Americans are taught at school, you cannot be separate and equal. It's a contradiction in terms. And if you are separate, that means you are apart. And if you are apart, that means that your ideological principle is on all fours with apartheid. There's more to it than that, but I thought I'd just begin with the joint statement and build from there. Now, let's zoom in on the word bicommunalism and at the same time have regard to bizonality. It might help if we had a look at the map that was embodied within the ill-fated Annan Plan of 2004, which again I have to declare an interest here I campaigned against from afar in the United Kingdom. By the way, I didn't have a vote in 2004 here in Cyprus, and interestingly enough, I didn't have a vote in the Scottish referendum, because one of the catastrophic mistakes Mr Cameron made as Prime Minister was that he and the British Parliament allowed Scotland to have a separate referendum and the separate right to break away from the United Kingdom without us in England or our colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland having a say in the matter. So I don't know what's going to happen in the constitutional future of Cyprus, but do not fall into the trap that the British have fallen into of granting a part of your country the right to have a unilateral referendum. Bicommunalism. It's a euphemism, it's a cloak, it's a term that's misleading. Why is it misleading? It's misleading because it doesn't really mean the number 2 all of the time. And the same applies for bizonality. Bizonality does not really mean 2 zones. It means 4 zones. Let's be clear. If there is a settlement of the Cyprus question in accordance with what is being discussed in Nicosia, you will not end up with 2 constitutionally established zones. You will have 4 constitutionally established zones. You will have, if we use the Annan Plan terminology, a Greek Cypriot constituent state in the south, a Turkish Cypriot constituent state in the north, and you'll also have 2 British sovereign base areas, perhaps in truncated form, but you will still nonetheless have 2 sovereign base areas in the south with the stamp of approval from the electorate. So you'll end up with 4 zones. Now, I'm not here to say that the British bases should close down or change. I'm merely making the point that bizonality is a euphemism. It's a misleading term, because we're not talking about 2 zones, we're talking about 4. The same point applies to the constitutional structures that will emerge from a bicommunal and bizonal federation. You will have 2 communities with 2 zones, with 2 leaders, with 2 electoral rolls, with 2 referenda results. But you will also have a public sector serving 3 constitutions, 3 parliaments, 3 governments, 3 judiciaries, 3 offices of Attorney General, 3 offices of Auditor General, 3 ombudsmen, 3 this, 3 that, 3 the other. And to throw in the British, you might have a 4th set of courts down in the sovereign base areas as well. So bicommunalism and bizonality together pervert the principles of arithmetic. Now that's okay in America or in the Russian Federation, when you have a large country and you need a federal setup. But in a small island such as Cyprus, it's absurd to carve up your constitution in this way and to have multiple layers of government. Now, I'm not a management consultant and I'm not an economist, but I've seen the disaster that's befallen the United Kingdom economically with the banking crash. I've gone enough times to Greece to see the disaster that's befallen Greece over the Eurozone disaster. And one of the lessons of recent history is that a sovereign state should have a lean, agile and cost-effective public sector. You can't have a lean, agile and cost-effective public sector with 3 parliaments, 3 governments, 3 judiciaries and so on. And on the plane coming over, I think I read in The Spectator, there's a principle called, I think it's a variation of Parkinson's law, I think they call it. The more bureaucracy you have, the less efficiency you have. And some of you who've worked in the Cyprus government may agree or disagree with that. But this is what you're asking for. You're asking for a bloated public sector. And who is going to pay for it? Now we come to, before we turn to the meat in the sandwich, which is the meaning of bicommunalism, I just want to say a word or two about Belgium. Belgium is often touted as the European precedent that should be used to try and inspire a settlement here in Cyprus. I understand that Mr. Erdogan, back in 2002, was a fan of the Belgian constitution and its application in some way here in Cyprus. Well, that was back in 2002. I may be wrong because I haven't seen the archives from the Annan Plan era. I don't know what's happened with the Annan Plan archives, whether they exist. But I understand from reading one or two sources that the Belgian constitution was one of those that was drawn upon to prepare the constitution, one of the three constitutions in the Annan Plan and the structures of the Annan Plan. Well, Belgium is, to all intents and purposes, a failing state. It may not be a failed state, but it's certainly a failing state. It holds the world record, I understand, for not having a government. They went 541 days without a government. That was in 2010 to 2011. So, I asked the question, do you really want to have Belgium as your model? Carving your population up into segments, empowering those segments, and then ending up, as that cartoon illustrates, with gridlock and constitutional turmoil. Now that we come to the real crux of my talk, what do we really mean by these terms that trip off the tongue of politicians, academics, diplomats, journalists, and so on? What do we mean by the two communities? What do we mean by the Greek community, which is the phrase appearing in the Constitution of the Republic of Cyprus from 1960? What do we mean by the Turkish community, which also appears in the 1960 Constitution? What do we mean by the terms bicommunal and bicommunalism? Very important questions. Let's have a look at the, does anybody know, by the way? Is it something? No, what do we mean by bicommunal?
It's from.
I'm not going to repeat that, but it's a very interesting word that's been used. I'm not going to repeat some of these remarks, but bicommunalism is all of these terms are euphemisms. It's an English word of Greek origin. These are cloaks. Under the 1960 Constitution, which was drafted by a joint constitutional commission which included representatives from Greek, Turkey and Cyprus, the Greek community comprises all citizens of the Republic who are of Greek origin and whose mother tongue is Greek, or who share the Greek cultural traditions, or who are members of the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Greek community is a euphemism for the Greek language, Greek ethnicity, and the Greek Orthodox Church. The Turkish community means all citizens of the Republic who are of Turkish origin and whose mother tongue is Turkish, or who share the Turkish cultural traditions, or who are Muslims. So the Turkish community is a euphemism to disguise what it really means, which is the Turkish language, Turkish ethnicity, and Islam. So taken together, the Greek community and the Turkish community means, in reality, two languages, two ethnicities, and two faiths. Now that wouldn't matter. We're all Democrats here. We're all in favour of everybody having the right to speak their language, to cherish their ethnicity, and to practice their faith. But what the 1960 Constitution has done, and this is what bicommunalism does as a principle, is that it splits down the middle of the citizens, and it puts them, as this room is, into two segments. You're over there because you speak Turkish and you're Muslims, and you're over here because you're Greek and you speak Greek and you're Greek Orthodox Christian. And if you're not a Turk, and if you're not a Greek, you have to opt in to one of these two if you want to be a citizen. So bicommunalism in common with the 1960 Constitution, is what we call in England now. We didn't have this phrase in the past. It's a wonderful phrase that we owe to Sir William McPherson, a retired High Court judge. The 1960 Constitution and bi-communalism are institutionally racist and unwittingly racist. And what that means is that the system is geared in favour of these two communities. And if you don't happen to belong to these two communities, you are subject to the most insidious type of racism, which is institutional racism and unwitting racism. There's a more subtle form of racism, but because it's more subtle, it's regarded as insidious, damaging and deeply immoral, and very, very damaging. And at a time when, here in the Republic of Cyprus, we have a multi-ethnic, multi-faith community in the singular, notice my choice of the term, we should be embracing the diversity of the population and integrating the migrants and the refugees and the other people who've arrived here in recent years. And we should be building our constitution based on the demographic realities of the Republic of Cyprus today, not the policies of the past, which I will come to in a moment or two. So bi-communalism is a euphemism to divide, to disguise the division of people along the lines of language, ethnicity and religion. But what does that word bi-communalism mean? It's almost an ideology in the way we refer to communism or Nazism or socialism. It is in a way an ideology, but it's not defined in the Oxford English Dictionary. The word bi is defined. Bi is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as connoting the sense that something is having or is furnished with two elements. Communalism is defined. So we have a look at, I'll explain to you what communalism means according to the Oxford English Dictionary. It offers a number of variations. Communalism is a principle or system of social organisation in which the major political units of society are local, self-governing communities. So there's an element of self-governing embodied within the definition of communalism. Secondly, communalism embodies communal living, usually with common ownership of property, and the organisation of society at the level of the community rather than the individual. Communalism gives primacy to the community rather than the individual. Western liberal democracy is predicated on us, you, the individual, the empowerment of the individual. The individual has become a consumer. We are empowered by law, by courts, by parliament, as citizens of a state, as individuals, and as consumers. Communalism subordinates the individual to the interests of the community. And if you don't happen to be Greek or Turkish and don't fall neatly into one of those two camps, you are coerced constitutionally into one of those two camps if you want to be a citizen. And you are thereby de-individualised. I won't go as far as to say that you're dehumanised, but you are de-individualised because you are subservient to the community. The Oxford English Dictionary goes on to explain that the origin of communalism is South Asian, and it entails, this is very important, as the microphone is playing up. Communalism owes its origins to South Asia, and it entails strong allegiance to one's own ethnic or religious group, rather than to a society or nation as a whole. And communalism is thereby associated with religious factionalism, ethnocentrism, and the structuring of society or politics is the basis of this. Now, sometimes people like me are accused of being nationalists or hardliners. It's a misleading allegation to the level of me. I would suggest that by communalism is a euphemism, not just for two ethnicities, two languages, two faiths. Bicommunalism is also a euphemism for two forms of nationalism. And bicommunalism fuels nationalism. Do you want to see the evidence? Look at Cyprus after 1960. Look at Bosnia. Look at Northern Ireland. Look at Iraq. Look at Sudan. Look at Nigeria. I can go on. Do we really want to build the constitutional future of Cyprus on two forms of nationalism and on a concept that fuels nationalism, especially in view of the history that we've had on this island, where nationalism has given rise to countless deaths of people from all backgrounds, of all faiths, of all ethnicities? That's why I come back to my primary argument. The future of Cyprus must rest not on bicommunalism, but on the concept of one island, one people, one community, one parliament, one government, one judiciary, one public service, and one united, integrated population where everybody adheres to the rule of law, the principles of liberal democracy, secularism, pluralism, and the dedication to upholding the fundamental, honourable and ethical values of the country. What will be the honourable, ethical, fundamental values of a bicommunal, bizonal federation? I nearly said bizonal, bicommunal separation. But that's potentially what it is. The values are them and us. The values are Greeks and Turks. The values are separate but equal. The values are division. And that, in my view, is a bleak, dishonourable, unethical, unconscionable, unfair, and morally repugnant objective. Why has bicommunalism emerged as the constitutional pillar of the Republic of Cyprus, if we think of it as 1960? And why is bicommunalism one of the pillars of the joint statement and of the UN Security Council resolutions? The answer is complex, but it boils down to this. We need to understand pre-1960 history. Bicommunalism owes its origins to the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus and the practices of the Ottoman Empire. But in more recent times, the idea of bicommunalism and bizonality owes its origins to British Imperial India. In the last days of British Imperial India, in the last years rather, of British Imperial India, the leader of the Muslim League of India, as it then was, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a barrister by profession, a member of Lincoln's Inn, came up with the idea that the Indian question, as it then was, should be settled by means of the creation of a, you guessed it, bicommunal, bizonal federation. He had in mind Hindustan, or a Hindustan zone for the Hindus, and a Pakistan zone primarily for Muslims. Now, I don't know to what extent Mr. Denktash was influenced by Jinnah. There's some reports that he'd like to describe himself as the Jinnah of Cyprus. But Mr. Denktash went to Lincoln's Inn when he went to study law in the university in London, and he was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn. And as I understand it, he was at Lincoln's Inn from 1944 to 1947, in the last 3 years of British rule in India. So I'd ask the question, to what extent was Mr. Denktash influenced by the philosophy of Jinnah and the idea of a bicommunal, bizonal federation in India, British Imperial? Nothing came of that, of course. And India ended up being, British Imperial India rather, ended up being partitioned into various parts. Now, I'm not making any apology for going into this history, because I know the diplomats don't like us dredging up history, but because it's inconvenient and it's it obstructs what the diplomats want to do, which is to reach a settlement, and to get on, move on and earn a Nobel Peace Prize. But I'm mentioning the history because with Aristotle said you can't understand anything unless you go back to the beginning and examine how and why that thing began, how it was conceived, how it developed, and how it emerged, how it was born, and so on. As far as Cyprus is concerned, the immediate origins of what we might term Republican bicommunalism, that's to say post-1960 bicommunalism, that form of bicommunalism owes its origins to two people, really, among others. Professor Nihat Erim, who was the Turkish constitutional scholar, who was an advisor to Mr. Menderes, the Prime Minister of Turkey, from 1950 until 1960. And the other one is Fatih Zorlu, who was the Foreign Minister of Turkey during the final part of the 50s. Now, I owe a great deal to Christo Yagovu and Neogli Sari and others who've written about Nihat Erim. I don't read Turkish, so I can't really translate his work, so I'm reliant on the works of people like Christo Yagovu. And what emerges from those analyses is that Nihat Erim came up with what might be termed the 5 pillars of partition. One of the 5 pillars of partition was the notion that in Cyprus there are 2, and no more than 2, communities. Now, Erim came up with this idea in 1956 with 2 reports he furnished to Mr. Menderes. So the idea that we have 2 communities in Cyprus owes its immediate origins to 1956. Then Mr. Zorlu comes into the picture as a foreign minister, and in 1958 he starts, this is the back end of British imperial rule here in Cyprus. He comes together with the Greek foreign minister, Mr. Averov, and Mr. Zorlu persuades Mr. Averov to create an independent, so-called independent, in fact, the word independent didn't appear in the Zurich Agreement, forgive me, to establish a bicommunal state of Cyprus. And Mr. Averov, wittingly or unwittingly, accepted that premise. So we ended up with a Zurich Agreement, which was predicated on the creation of a bicommunal state, and that was presented as an agreement to the British. The British agreed it, subject to the retention of the sovereign base areas and the retention of Cyprus as a base, which is another story for today. And we ended up with a London conference, and the idea of a bicommunal state was presented as a non-negotiable fait accompli to Archbishop Magarios and Mr. Dr. Puchuk, and they were invited to rubber stamp the Zurich London Agreement, which they did after a bit of a delay. And the very fact that you had, there we have it, the very fact that you had an archbishop as the head of the community is sort of a manifestation of bicommunalism and a defeat for secularism. Now, I'm not making a criticism of Archbishop Magarios. He was a product of Ottomanism and bicommunalism. And of course, he had a vested interest in not having a secular Republic of Cyprus, because if he'd have insisted on there being a secular Republic of Cyprus, he wouldn't have become president. That's another story. The point I'm making is that Mr. Zorlu insisted on there being a bicommunal Republic of Cyprus. Now, when the Zurich London agreements were finalised, they needed to be approved by the British Parliament, so they were presented to the British Parliament, and the Cyprus bill was presented to Parliament. Interestingly enough, when India became independent, it became independent under the India Independence Act. When Malaya became independent, it was the Malaya Independence Act. Burma became independent under the Burma Independence Act. Nigeria, which became independent on the same day as such, was established under the Nigeria Independence Act. Cyprus was established under the Cyprus Act. Now, we shouldn't read too much into the title of an Act of Parliament, but it's quite interesting that in the history of British decolonisation, Cyprus came into existence as a bicommunal republic in accordance with an Act of Parliament that omitted the word independent from the title. Now, why is all this relevant? Because when the Cyprus bill was presented to Parliament with all of the supporting papers, a number of members of Parliament in the House of Commons and House of Lords, as the British tend to do, raised their eyebrows. They were puzzled as to why a bicommunal republic was going to be established. And I know he's not very popular in Cyprus, but we have to give credit to Field Marshal the Lord Harding of Petherton, because Field Marshal the Lord Harding, the penultimate governor of Cyprus, who objected to partition, by the way, stood up in the House of Lords and said, hang on a second, why are we talking about two communities? There are more than two communities in Cyprus. He clearly had in mind the Armenians, the Maronites, the Latins, perhaps the Roma and the few Jews and British who were scattered around the place. But Field Marshal Harding spotted that there was something wrong with this. And indeed, in the aftermath of the Turkish invasion, he wrote a letter to the Spectator in which he made the very same point. And by the way, called for the establishment of a unitary Republic of Cyprus. I think Governor Harding, we'll get into trouble for here, but he's not quite the devil that he's sometimes made out. Just to make that point in a very careful way. The point I'm trying to bring across is that Governor Harding, or ex-Governor Harding, spotted that there was something wrong. He smelt a rat. And up stood Julian Amery, the British minister, and said, I'm terribly sorry, but there are two communities because Turkey has insisted that there are two communities, and Mr. Averov in Zurich agreed. So we have bicommunalism at the insistence of Zorlu at Zurich and at the insistence of Nihaterim in 1956. So when you see the word bicommunalism in the joint statement, it's a legacy of imperialism, Turkish imperialism and British imperialism, and it's a direct product of the Zurich Agreement. These are not reunification talks in Nicosia, because you cannot reunify something that wasn't unified in the first place. It stands to reason, doesn't it? If the Republic of Cyprus was established, split down the middle, with a form of what I describe as constitutional and administrative partition in 1960, how can you reunify that? It's a false premise. So these are not reunification talks. And that we don't even need to go to bisonality, because how can you reunify something by splitting it into four? It's not right. The point I'm trying to bring across to you is that what we need in the Republic of Cyprus, and I'm sorry to say this, is we need a peaceful, non-violent, second decolonisation campaign. And I say that with Malta partly in mind. Malta has two independent states. The first was when Malta was established as an independent state, and the second date is when the British left in 1979. I'm not calling for the British to leave, don't misunderstand me. There may be, I'm in favour of Anglo-Cypriot relations, and there may be a way in which the British sovereign base areas can be folded into the security structures of the Republic of Cyprus. I'm making the point, with regard to decolonisation, that the Republic of Cyprus is still under colonial rule. In the north, in the occupied area. We call it the occupied area, which it is, but it's a colonised area. It's all intents and purposes a colony of Turkey. So we need a decolonisation effort in relation to the occupied area. But we also need what is more subtle than that, a constitutional and administrative decolonisation process to weed out of the Republic of Cyprus the traces of imperialism which are embodied within the concept of bicommunalism. I hope that makes sense. I'll just move on, and I'm conscious of the time. I'll get 10 minutes, that's good. That brings me to I can't leave this talk without saying something about bizonality, because bizonality is a counterpart to bicommunalism. Remember, in 1960, what the Turkey achieved, it was a diplomatic triumph. What Turkey achieved in 1960 was the constitutional and administrative partition of Cyprus with the full force of law, and with the approval of Archbishop Magarios and Dr. Kutchuk and the British and the Greeks and the Turks. there was constitutional and administrative partition in 1960. And what Turkey managed to achieve de facto in 1974 was the counterpart to constitutional and administrative partition, which is geographical partition, demographic partition, and thus segregation, or apartheid, take your pick. The negotiations here in Nicosia, in my view, are not a reunification process. They're not really a peace process unless you look at the ancient Greek definition of peace. And there are two versions of peace in ancient Greek. I'll let you look it up afterwards and you'll see what I mean. They're not really it's not really a peace process. It's a surrender process. And the objective is not the formulation of a settlement plan. The objective is the composition of an instrument of surrender. Why do I say that? The British, and I'm British and I love the British, they are experts at washing their dirty linen in public. So we have inquiries where we discover all the dirty linen. It sometimes takes a while for stuff to come out. We have a Freedom of Information Act now. We discovered the other day what Prince Charles was saying to ministers behind the scenes, because we have the Freedom of Information Act and various other legislation. And we have a national archive. And I'm a historian as well as a law lecturer. And the British have published the document, many of the documents from 1974. The Foreign Office has published them. And I've been to the archives many times, but I'll just read to you just a couple of documents from 1974, which explain to us what Turkey's objectives were before the invasion. So let me just give you 2 or 3 examples, and then I'll close. The first example, and I haven't even, before we get there, I'll come to that later. Actually, I'll do it now. I should have said this earlier, I'm going to rewind. Bicommunalism, of course, is a variant of separate but equal, which was the discredited constitutional doctrine of apartheid in South Africa and segregation in America. Hopefully those 2 images make that point for me. Because what the Turkish invasion has done is it's produced segregation, and it has enabled the separate but equal doctrine to be potentially applicable by law in Cyprus, subject to a signature. Here's the first document. It's a letter from the British High Commissioner, Mr. Olber, to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on the 27th of February 1974. And the British High Commissioner is reporting upon his conversation with a Mr. Inhan, the Deputy Head of Mission at the Turkish Embassy in Nicosia, before the invasion. What were Turkey's objectives in February 1974? A bicommunal state. Not the annexation of Cyprus or the conquest of Cyprus, a bicommunal state. B, a federal system, or to call a spade, federation. C, federation cannot admittedly work without a geographical base, therefore some degree of transfer of population might be involved. So biconstitutionality requires a bicommunal state, a federal system, otherwise known as federation, and a geographical base, and a geographical base requires a transfer of population. And in these Turkish areas, there would be a completely self-contained and autonomous Turkish administration from the district office downwards, and this in turn must be responsible to a self-contained central Turkish administration. So you need a central Turkish administration, or as is transpired, a state in the occupied area. The result would be a federal state of Cyprus, independent, supposedly, sovereign, perhaps with guarantees for its future by Turkey and Greece. This could not come about overnight, the High Commissioner concludes, and intercommunal talks were of course useful in the meanwhile. So before the invasion, this was what Turkey had in mind. And I'll just read you the second document. There are others that I could spend all night reading to you these documents, but the second one it revolves getting here. And as I'm in the organisation representing the refugees from Korea, I ought to read this to you. It sent a shiver down my spine, and it reinforced to me how unjust and unethical and morally repugnant bisonality is in terms of its origins. Remember Aristotle looked at the origins of something. This is what we mean by bisonality in terms of its spiritual and its moral basis. So the High Commissioner, Mr. Olber, reporting to the Foreign Office on the 5th of August 1974, so between the first and second phases of the invasion. The High Commissioner, the British High Commissioner, writes, "A transfer of the Greek Cypriot population out of the Kyrenia area is going on steadily. This is undoubtedly considered Turkish policy, and people are being told that they will never come back. This is tragic, and we must obviously do what we can to contest these forced evictions. In the long run, however, a Kyrenia province largely populated by Turkish Cypriots, with the rest of the island mainly Greek Cypriot, might be communally more stable than the present situation, provided that program of voluntary transfer, once things settle down, would not necessarily be a bad thing." And on he goes in a similar vein. "A fully federal solution is clearly the least that the Turks will accept. Many Turks here, including Mr. Denktash, openly bemoan the slowness of their generals in not grabbing more land." That, ladies and gentlemen, is the moral basis of bisonality. It rests on the crime of forced eviction of people from their homes. It rests on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and arguably genocide. What has befallen the Kyrenians in this room and the other refugees in this room is a crime. And what bisonality is trying to do is to lend a facade of legitimacy to the consequences of crime. And that is why it's morally repugnant and an objection, and why it cannot be improved. I'm going to come to a close in a moment or two, but I can't leave this subject. There, of course, are some of the refugees from 74. Kurt Waldheim was brought onto the scene after 1974 to lend legitimacy to this. Remember, the British support, I regret to say this, and I think it's a stain on the conscience of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom endorsed the establishment of a bi-communal bi-zonal federation. Dr. Kissinger wrote on the back of that, it wasn't the other way around, it was Dr. Kissinger wrote on the back of the British support for a bi-communal bi-zonal federation. And of course the British wrote on the back of the Turks. The Secretary General of the United Nations from 1972 until 1981 was Dr. Kurt Waldheim. He came here, and many of you will remember him, and hope was pinned on him as the guardian of the rule of law, as the custodian of human rights, as the representative of everything that is good and noble about the 1945 generation that created the United Nations,